My designation is Genitor Kappa 12, and I am a monument to the weakness of flesh. 90% of my original biological form has been replaced with superior augmetics. My limbs are pistons and servo motors of blessed steel. My organs are efficient machinery that requires no rest, no sustenance beyond promethium and sacred oils. My brain, well, most of it, is augmented with cogitator implants that process information at speeds no unmodified human could achieve. I am perfection. I am the Omnisea's vision made manifest. At least, that's what I used to believe. Let me take you back to the beginning, to when I was just Marden Cross, a young initiate on the forge world of Metallica, staring at my inadequate hands and dreaming of transcendence. I was 17 when I took my first augmentation. A simple bionic right arm to replace the limb I'd lost in a manufactorum accident. The augmetic was crude by my current standards. Basic servo motors, minimal sensory feedback, powered by a simple battery pack. But to young Marden, it was a revelation. The arm was stronger than my biological one. It never tired. It could grip with precisely calibrated pressure, could work for hours without the tremors that plagued human muscles. It was objectively superior in every measurable way. I stood in the augmentation chapel after the surgery, flexing my new fingers, and I felt something I'd never experienced before. Inadequacy. Not of the augmetic, but of my remaining flesh. My left arm seemed pathetic by comparison. Weak, unreliable, prone to fatigue and injury. Why would the Omnissiah create us with such flawed vessels? Why give us bodies that broke so easily, that wore out, that betrayed us? Unless this was the test. The flesh was intentionally weak to encourage us to transcend it, to seek the perfection of the machine. That thought took root in my mind like a sacred algorithm, and it never left. Over the next 5 years, I rose through the ranks of the Mechanicus. I demonstrated aptitude for genetic manipulation and biological augmentation, earning my Genitor classification. I studied the sacred texts, memorized the 16 universal laws of machine efficiency, performed the rites of maintenance with precision that impressed even senior magos. And with each accomplishment, I augmented myself further. At 22, I replaced my left arm. Bilateral symmetry, I reasoned. Both arms should be equal in capability. At 24, I replaced my legs. Why walk with fragile bone and muscle when servo pistons could carry me faster and without fatigue? At 27, I replaced my eyes. Biological vision was so limited, such a narrow spectrum, such poor resolution in darkness. My new optical implants could see into infrared and ultraviolet, could magnify distant objects, could interface directly with data streams. Each replacement was an improvement. Each surgery brought me closer to perfection. My colleagues congratulated me. Such devotion to the Omnissiah, they said. Such commitment to transcending the weakness of flesh. Magos Row 9, my supervisor, examined my augmentations with approval. You progress rapidly, Kappa 12, he said, using the designation I'd adopted after my 20th augmentation. Soon you will be more machine than man, a true servant of the machine god. The flesh is weak, Magos, I responded, the mantra that had become my guiding principle. Only through the purity of the machine can we achieve our true potential. He nodded, his own mechanical jaw clicking with approval. Indeed, continue your work. By age 35, I'd replaced 60% of my biological form. My respiratory system was now a recycler unit. Atmospheric processors that extracted oxygen with perfect efficiency, required no unconscious regulation, and could function in environments that would kill baseline humans. My digestive system was replaced with a nutrient paste converter. No more wasting time eating multiple times per day. A single canister of nutrient paste every 48 hours provided all necessary sustenance. My heart was replaced with a more efficient pump, no irregular beats, no risk of failure, perfect circulation. I was becoming glorious. The augmentation chambers became my temple. I spent more time there than in my hab unit. Each surgery was a religious experience, a shedding of weakness, an ascension toward the divine. I remember the day I replaced my sense of taste, the genitor performing the surgery. Magos Delta 31 questioned the necessity. Taste serves a biological function, she noted. It helps identify nutritional content and toxins. I no longer consume biological food, I countered. Taste is vestigial. The neural pathways it occupies can be better utilized for data processing. She performed the surgery. The taste receptors in my tongue were removed, the neural connections severed and replaced with additional cognitive enhancers. I consumed my first nutrient paste afterwards. It was efficient. No flavor to distract from function. Just fuel entering the converter, nothing more. Perfect. At 40, I replaced portions of my brain. This was the most significant surgery yet. The mechanicist had developed advanced cogitator implants that could replace certain brain regions entirely. Memory storage transferred to crystalline data matrices, emotional regulation handled by logic engines, sensory processing managed by specialized sub-processors. The procedure took 14 hours. When I woke, the world was different. Everything was sharper, clearer, more defined. I could process information with unprecedented speed. Complex calculations that would have taken minutes now resolved in seconds. I could access my memory with perfect recall. Dates, specifications, conversations, all indexed and retrievable like files in a data vault. I was thinking better, faster, more efficiently. The only side effect was a slight discontinuity in older memories. Some events from my childhood seemed less vivid, as if they'd been compressed to save storage space, but that was acceptable. Those memories were largely irrelevant to my current function. By age 50, I was 75% augmented. I'd replaced my skin with synthetic dermis, temperature-regulated, self-repairing, resistant to radiation and chemical exposure. My remaining organs were upgraded with synthetic versions. My skeletal structure was reinforced with ceramite implants. I had 4 mechadendrites now, mechanical tentacles that extended from my back, each equipped with specialized tools. They functioned as additional limbs, controlled by neural impulses as naturally as my original arms. I was magnificent. Other tech priests looked at me with admiration. Younger initiates asked how I'd achieved such comprehensive augmentation. Senior majors included me in high-level projects, trusting that my enhanced capabilities made me ideal for complex work. I was assigned to genetic manipulation projects, improving servitor efficiency, optimizing human biology for specialized environments, designing augmentations for other tech priests. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was improving biological systems while systematically eliminating my own. But biology was flawed. That was the point. I studied it to understand its weaknesses, to identify what needed to be replaced. At 60, I replaced more of my brain. The emotional centers were largely vestigial, I reasoned. Fear, anger, sadness, these were survival mechanisms for primitive humans. I no longer needed them. The neural tissue dedicated to emotional processing could be better used for logical operations. The surgery was routine. Afterwards, I felt clearer. Decisions that had once seemed complicated by emotional considerations were now straightforward. I could evaluate options purely on logical merits, without irrational feelings clouding my judgment. My efficiency improved by 17%. When Magos Ronine died in a plasma reactor accident, I attended his funeral rites. The other tech priests expressed grief, those who still possessed sufficient biological neural tissue for such responses. I felt nothing. Just observed the inefficiency of emotional displays, noted the time wasted on mourning when work could be done. It was perfect. I'd transcended such weaknesses. At 70, I replaced my remaining sensory organs. Hearing was upgraded to enhanced audio receptors with wider frequency range. Touch was replaced with pressure and temperature sensors throughout my synthetic skin. Even my sense of smell, largely useless in the filtered atmospheres of the Mechanicus, was replaced with chemical analyzers. I could detect compounds humans couldn't smell, could hear frequencies beyond biological range, could feel with precision measured in fractions of degrees and grams of pressure. My senses were superior in every measurable way. By age 80, I'd reached 85% augmentation. Only small portions of my original biological form remained, sections of brain tissue not yet replaced, some neural pathways that were too complex to safely augment, a few organs whose function was still imperfectly understood. I was nearly complete, nearly perfect. Magos Theta 7, one of the senior geneticists, called me into his laboratory. Kappa 12, he said, his vocal synthesizer crackling slightly. Your work on servitor automation has been exceptional, but I have concerns. Concerns, Magos? I processed his statement. What could be concerning about my work? Not about your work, about you. He gestured at my heavily augmented form. You've replaced much of your original biology. Do you ever experience difficulties? Define difficulties, I requested. Dysphoria. Disconnection. The sense that something is wrong with your physical form. I processed the question. No, Magos. My augmentations function optimally. All systems report within normal parameters. I experience no difficulties. He studied me for a long moment. I see. Continue your work, Kappa 12. I left his laboratory, dismissing his concerns. Difficulties. My augmentations were the solution to difficulties, not the cause. At 90, I performed my final major augmentation. I replaced the last significant portions of my brain, the sections responsible for memory consolidation, for processing long-term recall, for maintaining continuity of consciousness. These were replaced with crystalline data matrices and quantum processors. My memories would now be stored perfectly, indexed flawlessly, retrievable instantly. The surgery took 22 hours. When I woke, everything was different. Not wrong, just different. I could remember everything since the surgery with perfect clarity, but memories from before, from my childhood, my youth, my early years in the Mechanicus, they seemed distant, not lost but compressed, like files that had been archived to save space. I accessed a memory of my mother. I could retrieve the data. Her name was Ilara Cross. She worked in the manufactorums. She had brown hair. But I couldn't remember what her face looked like. The visual data was corrupted or deleted. I knew she existed, but I couldn't picture her. It didn't matter. That information was irrelevant to my current function. 95. I reached 90% augmentation. I was a masterwork of the Mechanicus. My biological components were minimal. Just enough brain tissue to maintain consciousness, a few neural pathways that couldn't yet be safely replaced, some support tissues. Everything else was machine. I was Genitor Kappa 12, more machine than man, servant of the Omnissiah, monument to the superiority of augmented existence. I was perfect. That's what I believed for 5 more years. Then, at age 100, something changed. It started small. I was working in my laboratory, manipulating genetic sequences for a new servitor variant, when I experienced an anomaly. A sensation I couldn't classify, not pain. I'd removed most pain receptors, not pleasure. Those pathways were minimal now. Something else, an absence, an emptiness. I ran diagnostics, all systems functional, no errors detected. But the sensation persisted. Over the following weeks, it intensified. I began noticing gaps. Not in my function. I performed my duties with perfect efficiency, but in my experience. I tried to remember what food tasted like. Real food, from before the augmentations. I accessed my memory files, found entries about meals I'd eaten, but I couldn't remember the taste. The sensory data was gone, replaced with analytical descriptions. Nutritionally adequate, contained carbohydrates and proteins. I tried to remember the last time I'd felt happy, truly happy, not just satisfied with efficient performance. I searched my memory, but couldn't find the data. Either it had been overwritten or the emotional context had been stripped when I'd replaced those brain regions. I tried to remember my father's voice. I knew he existed. Data file confirmed his name was Marcus Cross. But I couldn't recall the sound of his voice. The audio data was missing. These were irrelevant details. Why did they matter? But the question itself was troubling. Why did I care that they were gone? At 105, the dysphoria became undeniable. I was performing routine maintenance on my respiratory recycler when I noticed my hands, my augmetic hands, and I felt wrong. These weren't my hands. My hands had skin, had calluses, had small scars from childhood accidents. These were servo motors and artificial polymers shaped like hands. But I'd replaced my hands decades ago. Why was this bothering me now? I looked at my arms, pistons and cables and metal plates, not arms, just shaped like arms. I looked at my body. A chassis of metal and synthetic materials, not a body, just shaped like a body. I accessed my memory, trying to find visual data of my original form. Found a pic capture from age 16, before the augmentations began. That was me. Marred in cross, soft face, uncertain eyes, completely biological. I didn't recognize him. No, that's not accurate. I didn't recognize me. That person in the image was supposedly me, but I felt no connection to him. He was a stranger. What had I done? I ran diagnostics again. All systems functional. The dysphoria wasn't a malfunction. It was an emergent property of consciousness, recognizing its own modification. My own visionaries, highs, responses. I tried to dismiss it, focused on work, but the feeling persisted and grew stronger. At 108, I made a decision. I would reverse some augmentations, not all, that would be impossible, but perhaps some. Restore some of what I'd lost. I went to the augmentation chambers and requested consultation with the senior genator. I wish to reverse certain augmentations, I stated. The genator Magos Epsilon 19 processed my request. Clarify, which augmentations? My hands. I want biological hands again. Long pause. Explanation required. Your current augmetics function at 97% efficiency. Biological hands would be inferior, I understand. I want them anyway. Another pause. Request denied. Reversal is not possible. Explain. Your biological hands were removed 70 years ago. The organic tissue has long since been disposed of. Growing replacement hands would require genetic material and extensive tissue cultivation, but more significantly, the neural pathways that controlled biological hands have been repurposed. Your brain no longer has the architecture to properly control biological appendages. Reversal would result in non-functional limbs. I processed this information. There was nothing to go back to. My original biology hadn't been preserved. It had been discarded as waste, and even if we could grow replacement parts, my brain had been so extensively modified that I might not be able to use them. I had thought I was transcending my biology. I had actually been destroying it, and there was no way back. Year 110 of my existence. 2 years since the dysphoria manifested. It had not faded. If anything, it had metastasized, spreading through my consciousness like corrupted code. I began noticing things I'd ignored for decades. the way I moved through the corridors of the Forge world. My footsteps were mechanical, precise, rhythmic, identical. Servo motors in my legs activated in perfect sequence, each stride exactly 0.87 meters, each foot striking the ground with exactly 47.3 kilograms of force. Humans didn't walk like that. Biological movement had variation, slight irregularities, unconscious adjustments. It was inefficient, but it was human. I tried to introduce variation into my gait, commanded my leg servos to vary stride length, to adjust timing slightly. The result was stuttering, unnatural movement that drew attention from other tech priests. Kappa 12, are you experiencing mechanical difficulty? One inquired. Negative, functioning within normal parameters. I resume my regular gait. Precise, mechanical, inhuman. I returned to my hab unit that evening. Though evening was arbitrary on a Forge world with no natural day-night cycle, my sleep cycle optimizer had determined that 3.2 hours of rest per 24-hour period was optimal for my physiology. I lay on my maintenance cradle. I no longer had a bed, and initiated rest mode. My consciousness didn't fade into natural sleep. Instead, the optimizer reduced my cognitive function to minimal levels while running system diagnostics. It wasn't sleep. It was a controlled shutdown of non-essential processes. I was aware during it, distantly, like background noise, but aware. My consciousness never truly ceased. The optimizer wouldn't allow it. I'd forgotten what real sleep felt like. That gentle fade into unconsciousness, the complete cessation of awareness, the restoration of waking feeling truly rested. I rested efficiently now, but I never slept. During that 3.2-hour rest period, I tried to dream. Dreaming was a biological function I'd read about in old texts. The brain processing experiences, consolidating memories, creating strange narratives from random neural activation. I attempted to simulate it, allowed my consciousness to wander, to generate random memory associations. What emerged was not a dream. It was a data cascade. Files opening and closing, indexes cross-referencing, memories appearing as text entries rather than experiences. Henry _file _4407. Mother, designation, Elara Cross. Associated emotional data, corrupted. Visual data, missing. Audio data, partial. Last known recording indicates voice frequency 220 Hz. Typical speech pattern, formal/reserved. Relevance to current function, minimal. This was what passed for dreaming now. Data retrieval, formatted as technical readouts. I terminated rest mode early. Remaining in that state felt worse than activity. Year 112. I began observing other tech priests more carefully. Most were augmented, of course. The Mechanicus encouraged it, but I noticed that most maintained significant biological components. Many still had biological hands, even if they had mechadendrites as well. Most retained their original faces, even if they'd replaced their eyes. They walked with human irregularity, breathed with biological rhythm, showed micro-expressions on whatever flesh remained. It seemed humans are kind of, said Famil Freybor, referring to Weiss. They were enhanced humans. I was something else. Genitor Delta 31, who had performed many of my surgeries, still ate regular food. I encountered her in one of the communal spaces, consuming what appeared to be protein rations. You still eat biological food? I inquired. She looked up, her mostly human face showing surprise. Yes. I've retained my digestive system. Somewhat inefficient, but I prefer it. Where high? Eating is... She paused, searching for words. Pleasant. The taste, the texture, the social aspect of sharing meals. It reminds me of my humanity. Humanity is irrelevant. Only function matters. She studied me for a long moment. Does it? Then why are you asking? I had no adequate response. I left without further communication, but her words remained in my memory files. It reminds me of my humanity. What reminded me of my humanity? I searched my daily routines for anything that connected me to my biological origin. I found nothing. Every action was optimized for function. I consumed nutrient paste for efficiency. I performed maintenance instead of personal grooming. I communicated via data bursts when possible, rather than speech. My social interactions were transactional, exchange of necessary information, nothing more. I had optimized away everything that wasn't strictly functional, including everything that was human. Year 115. I began experiencing what the ancient texts called phantom limb syndrome. Though my limbs weren't missing, they'd been replaced. Sometimes I would feel my hands, my original, biological hands. Not the augmetic ones attached to my arms, but the ones I'd had 70 years ago. I'd feel them clench, feel the texture of skin on skin, feel the small imperfections of organic tissue. Then I'd look down and see servo motors and metal plates. The sensation would vanish, replaced by data streams. Pressure sensors reading atmospheric contact, temperature gauges measuring ambient conditions, position encoders tracking exact finger placement. Not feeling, just data. I tried to explain this to Apothecary Moose 6 during a routine maintenance check. I experience sensations that don't correspond to current input, I reported. Phantom sensory data from replaced biological components. We ran diagnostics on my neural implants. No malfunction detected. This is a known psychological phenomenon. Your brain occasionally generates sensory expectations based on pre-augmentation neural patterns. It's harmless. Can it be corrected? We could further modify your neural architecture to eliminate these phantom sensations. However, such modification would require replacing additional brain tissue. And if I don't? The sensations will likely persist or intensify, but they pose no functional risk. Declined further modification. Some instinct, some remaining fragment of self-preservation, warned me against replacing more of my brain. I was 90% augmented. What happened at 95%? At 99%? At what point would Kappa 12 cease to exist and become just another cogitator that happened to be mobile? Maybe that point had already passed. Year 118. I encountered an unaugmented human. This was rare on Forge Worlds. Most baseline humans served as menial workers or became servitors, but this individual was a diplomat from the Administratum, visiting to coordinate supply requisitions. I observed her during the meeting. She was completely biological. Soft skin, natural movement, facial expressions that shifted constantly. She ate solid food during the break, made small talk with other humans, even laughed at something someone said. She was so alive. After the meeting, I found myself watching the security footage of her departure, studying her movements, her expressions, trying to understand what I was seeing. She was inefficient. Her walking pace varied unpredictably. She paused to look at things that weren't relevant to her mission. She spent time on social interactions that conveyed no critical information. But she seemed whole, complete, integrated with her existence in a way I no longer was. I accessed my oldest memory files, from before the augmentations began, found records of myself at age 16 interacting with other initiates. I watched the picked captures and audio recordings. That young man, Martin Cross, moved like the diplomat, natural, variable, human. He laughed at jokes. He showed fear during dangerous procedures. He expressed excitement when learning new things. He was inefficient, but he was real. What was I? Year 120. I attempted to experience something for non-functional reasons. There was an observation deck on the Forge world's upper levels, rarely used. It had a viewport looking out at the planet's surface, a landscape of industrial complexes and mining operations stretching to the horizon. I went there during a low-activity period, stood at the viewport, observed. I tried to feel something about what I saw, tried to experience it beyond the data. Atmospheric composition, structural integrity of visible installations, estimated industrial output based on visible activity. I tried to find it beautiful or terrible or impressive or anything. I felt nothing, just processed information. I remembered or accessed memory files suggesting that I used to feel things when observing views. Awe at vast spaces, curiosity about distant structures, even boredom if the view wasn't interesting. Now there was just data processing, visual input converted to analyzable information, catalogued, filed. I stood at the viewport for 2.7 hours, trying to feel something. Nothing emerged, except the growing certainty that the capacity for that kind of experience had been surgically removed, replaced with cogitator processing that mimicked thought, but wasn't actually feeling. I left the observation deck and didn't return. Day, year 123, I began noticing my reflection. There were polished metal surfaces throughout the Forge world. I'd passed them for decades without attention, but now I found myself stopping, studying my reflection. The figure that looked back was barely humanoid. A metal chassis in roughly human shape, but clearly mechanical. My face was mostly synthetic skin, stretched over metal substructure, with optical implants where eyes should be. My skull was partially exposed, metal plates visible where hair used to be. I looked like a servitor, like the lobotomized cyborg slaves we created from failed criminals and damaged workers. Except servitors didn't have full consciousness. They were just biological processors for simple tasks. I had full consciousness, which made it worse. I was aware enough to recognize what I'd become, but trapped in this form without escape. One of the younger tech priests, Initiate Gamma 4, barely 30 years old, approached me in the corridor. "Genitor Kappa 12, he said with evident respect. "I wanted to ask your advice about augmentation. I'm considering replacing my lungs with respiratory recyclers. You have extensive experience with such modifications." I looked at him. He still had his original face, his biological eyes, his natural voice. He was perhaps 20% augmented, enough to be considered a true member of the Mechanicus, but still predominantly human. "What percentage augmentation do you aspire to?" I asked. "I hope to reach 60% by age 50, he said proudly, "following the example of great genitors like yourself." 60%. He thought that was ambitious. I was 90%, and I wanted to warn him. Wanted to explain that there was a point of no return, that he should stop while he was still human enough to be himself. But I didn't, because warning him would be admitting my own mistake, admitting that the Omnissiah's path, the path I'd championed, the path I'd used to justify everything I'd done to myself, might be flawed. "The flesh is weak," I said, the old mantra automatic. "Only through the machine do we find perfection." He nodded eagerly and left, inspired by my example. I had just condemned him to potentially repeat my mistakes. Year 125, I attempted to cry. I don't know what triggered the impulse. Perhaps accumulated dysphoria reaching critical mass. Perhaps some deep instinct that sadness should be expressed physically. I tried to cry, commanded my body to produce tears. Nothing happened. I'd removed my tear ducts decades ago, unnecessary for optical function. They just required maintenance. Now I had no physical mechanism for crying. I tried to simulate the physical responses associated with crying, tried to make my chest heave, my breathing irregular, my face contort. My respiratory recycler maintains steady, optimal oxygen exchange. My synthetic facial muscles had limited range, enough for basic expressions needed for communication, but not for complex emotional displays. I couldn't cry, couldn't physically express grief or sadness, even if I felt it. Did I feel it? I checked my emotional processing systems, registered elevated stress indicators, anomalous cognitive patterns suggesting distress, resource allocation showing priority to self-evaluation subroutines, the technical readout for sadness, but not sadness itself. I stood in my HAB unit, trying to cry, failing, and not even certain if I was actually sad or just experiencing a malfunction that resembled sadness. Year 127. I requested psychological evaluation. This was unusual. Tech priests rarely sought such services. We were supposed to be beyond psychological difficulties, transcendent through augmentation. That I presented myself to Mind Healer Omicron 3, one of the few tech priests who specialized in consciousness issues. State the nature of your difficulty, she requested. I am experiencing persistent dysphoria regarding my augmentation level. I have concerns about identity continuity and consciousness integrity. She ran diagnostic scans, examined my neural architecture, reviewed my augmentation history. You are 90% augmented, she noted. This is exceptional. Most genitors maintain 60 to 70% biological composition. I am aware. I believed I was pursuing perfection. Now I am uncertain. Describe your symptoms. I detailed everything, the phantom sensations, the memory gaps, the inability to connect with my past self, the growing sense of wrongness. She processed this information for several minutes. Your condition is known, she finally said. We call it threshold syndrome. It occurs when consciousness approaches critical augmentation levels, typically above 85%. The biological brain struggles to maintain continuous identity when most of its substrate has been replaced. Mankind's darkest ancestors, not reversed, if that's what you're asking. Your biological components are insufficient for deaugmentation. Treatment consists of either accepting your current state or proceeding to near-complete augmentation. Explain the second option. If you replace the remaining biological components, you become a fully artificial consciousness. Some tech priests report that the dysphoria vanishes at that point. You're no longer trying to be human with machine parts. You're simply machine. The conflict resolves. And if I don't, you continue existing as you are. The dysphoria will likely persist, but you remain something closer to human. The choice is yours. I left without making a decision. Complete the augmentation and become fully machine, potentially losing whatever remained of my humanity, or stay as I was, trapped in eternal dysphoria, neither human nor machine, but something incomplete. Both options were horror. Year 130. I made an attempt to die. Not suicide. That would violate the Omnissiah's teachings, but I requested assignment to a dangerous mission. A chaos-corrupted space hulk needed investigation. The mortality rate for such missions exceeded 70%. I thought, perhaps this is the answer. If I can't fix what I've become, at least I can end it. My request was approved. I joined a team of tech priests and servitors boarding the hulk. The mission was as dangerous as promised. We encountered corrupted machinery, structural failures, even warp-touched servitors. 3 tech priests died. I survived. Every time. When a corridor collapsed, my enhanced reflexes moved me to safety. When corrupted servitors attacked, my augmented strength prevailed. When warp energy surged, my reality stabilization implants protected me. I'd built myself to be too durable to die easily. The mission ended. We returned to the Forge world. I was commended for excellent performance. I had survived. Again, like I would continue surviving for another 100, 200 years. My redundant systems, my efficient organs, my robust construction, all the augmentations I'd installed to make myself superior, they ensured I would keep living, keep experiencing this dysphoric half-existence. I was trapped, not by external forces, but by my own perfection. I couldn't go back, couldn't move forward, couldn't die. I could only continue for decades, centuries potentially. A consciousness trapped in a machine I'd built myself, screaming silently in a shell of metal that would never let me escape. Year 135, I began cataloging my losses systematically. This was what Genitors did. We documented, we analyzed, we created records. So I applied my training to my own existence. I created a file titled Inventory of the Missing and began filling it with everything I could no longer do, no longer feel, no longer remember. Entry 1. Taste. Cannot remember the flavor of the following foods from childhood: mother's protein cakes, synthesized fruit supplements, standard ration bars. Memory files contain only nutritional analysis data, sensory context deleted. Entry 2. Smell. Original olfactory system replaced year 70. Can detect chemical compounds with superior accuracy, but cannot remember what pleasant smells felt like. Do flowers have a smell? Data indicates yes, but experiential memory missing. Entry 3. Touch. Current sensors detect pressure, temperature, texture at microscopic level, but cannot remember what human touch felt like, the sensation of skin on skin. Warmth of another person. Memory files indicate I had these experiences, but the sensory data is corrupted or overwritten. Entry 4. Sleep. Have not experienced natural sleep in 65 years. Sleep Cycle Optimizer maintains consciousness during rest periods. Cannot remember dreams. The sensation of truly waking rested. The comfort of genuine unconsciousness. Entry 5. Tears. Physical capability removed year 67. Cannot cry, regardless of emotional state. Cannot remember last time I cried. Memory search suggests age 19, reason unrecorded. The list grew longer. I worked on it during low activity periods, methodically documenting everything I'd lost. By entry 100, I stopped. Not because the list was complete, but because continuing felt like excavating a mass grave. My own grave. Filled with pieces of self I'd systematically discarded. Year 137. My memory problems worsened. I began noticing gaps in my personal history. Not technical knowledge, that remained perfect, but personal experiences, emotional contexts, the narrative of my life. I tried to remember my first augmentation surgery. I knew it happened. Records confirmed. Right arm replacement, age 17. But I couldn't remember how I felt about it. Fear? Excitement? Determination? The emotional data was gone. I tried to remember conversations with my parents before joining the Mechanicus. I knew they existed. Family logs confirmed regular communication until year 23. But I couldn't remember what we'd talked about. The content was deleted, leaving only timestamps and duration data. I tried to remember why I'd joined the Mechanicus. There should have been a reason, a moment of decision. But that memory was fragmented. Just pieces of data, suggesting aptitude for technical work and desire for improvement, without any cohesive narrative. My past was becoming a technical readout instead of a lived experience. I consulted the mind healer again. My memory continuity is degrading, I reported. Emotional and experiential context is being lost while technical information remains intact. Omicron 3 examined my neural architecture more thoroughly this time. Your crystalline data matrices prioritize certain types of information, she explained. Technical knowledge, procedural memory, analytical data, these are stored with high priority. Emotional context, sensory experiences, subjective impressions, these are lower priority and subject to compression or deletion when storage capacity is limited. Can this be changed? Not without replacing your current memory systems, but that would require even more extensive augmentation. You're experiencing a fundamental limitation of artificial memory storage. It doesn't preserve experience the same way biological memory does. 2. I'm losing myself, my history, everything that made me me. Chad, you're losing the subjective experience of your history. The facts remain. Whether that constitutes losing yourself is a philosophical question. I left more disturbed than when I'd arrived. The facts remained, but I wasn't facts. I was supposed to be a person, and persons were more than just technical readouts. Weren't they? U-139. I attempted to reconnect with my past. I accessed public records and found my family registry. My mother, Elara Cross, had died 30 years ago. My father, Marcus Cross, was still listed as alive, age 156, residing in the worker hab sections. I had a father, still living. I hadn't communicated with him in 116 years. I accessed the last recorded communication, a brief message sent from him on my 24th birthday. Proud of your progress in the Mechanicus. Your mother and I hope you're well. Love, Father. I'd never responded. The message was marked as read but not replied to. Why hadn't I responded? I searched my memory files, found a note I'd made. Family communication irrelevant to current function, priority allocated to research. I'd deemed my family irrelevant, had stopped responding to their messages, had functionally abandoned them to pursue my augmentation. And now my mother was dead and I'd never said goodbye. Never told her. What? I didn't even know. The emotional context was gone. I drafted a message to my father. Father, I am Kappa 12, formerly Marden Cross. I have not contacted you in 116 years. I am uncertain what to communicate. I stared at the draft for 2.7 hours, then deleted it. What would I say? I wasn't Marden anymore. I was Kappa 12. And Kappa 12 had no relationship with Marcus Cross. That connection had been severed by decades of silence, and the systematic replacement of whoever Marden had been. I didn't send any message. Year 140. I began observing servitors more carefully. Servitors were everywhere on the Forge world, lobotomized cyborgs performing simple tasks, failed criminals, damaged workers, vat-grown bodies, all repurposed as biological components for machines. They disturbed other humans, these things that looked almost human but moved with mechanical precision, faces slack, eyes empty. But I'd noticed something troubling. I moved like them. We had the same mechanical precision, the same efficient movements, the same lack of unnecessary actions. When servitors performed tasks, they moved exactly as much as required, no more, no less. So did I. The difference was consciousness. Servitors had been lobotomized, their higher functions removed. I retained full consciousness. But from external observation we were similar. Both human-shaped machines performing functions with mechanical efficiency. Was consciousness the only real difference? And was my consciousness even fully human anymore? Or was it just a very sophisticated cogitator that thought it was human? I watched a servitor lifting supply crates. Its movements were smooth, efficient, precisely calibrated. It showed no fatigue, No variation, no personality. I watched myself afterwards, reviewing security footage of my own work. My movements were smooth, efficient, precisely calibrated. I showed no fatigue, no variation, no personality. We were the same, except the servitor had never been anything else, and I had chosen to become this. Which of us was more tragic? Year 142. I stopped attending social functions. The Mechanicus had various gatherings, review sessions, ceremonial rites, even occasional social assemblies where tech priests could interact informally. I'd attended these throughout my career, but increasingly I found them difficult. Other tech priests would discuss their work, share insights, even engage in what passed for casual conversation among the Mechanicus. They communicated with vocal inflection, with gesture, with the small social signals that made interaction feel natural. I could no longer do this. My vocal synthesizer had limited emotional range. My face had minimal expression capability. My body language was mechanical. No more energy to respond. No more energy. When I spoke, other tech priests would pause slightly before responding, as if they needed a moment to process that they were interacting with something that spoke, but wasn't quite social. I watched them communicate, watched the subtle flow of conversation, the ways they built rapport, the small touches of humanity that made them colleagues rather than just co-workers. I couldn't participate. I could only simulate participation, delivering information in response to queries, but not truly engaging. So I stopped attending, returned to my HAB unit and laboratory, where I could work alone, where my mechanical nature wasn't constantly contrasted with others' remaining humanity. Isolation was easier than pretending I was still capable of genuine social interaction. Year 145. I attempted to reverse a minor augmentation. I'd kept this one option available. My right hand's smallest finger was still mostly biological, reinforced with minor support structures, but essentially organic. I'd never gotten around to replacing it, and later it seemed insignificant enough not to bother with. Now, I thought, if I could reverse anything, start to reclaim anything, it should be this. I consulted with Genitor Delta 31. I want to remove the support structures from my right smallest finger, restore it to fully biological function. She examined it. Possible, but impractical. The biological tissue has atrophied significantly from disuse. It would be weak, prone to injury, inferior to your other fingers. I understand. I want it anyway. She performed the surgery, removed the support structures, treated the biological tissue, restored it to independent function. The result was exactly as she'd warned. The finger was weak, trembled slightly when I moved it, couldn't grip with the same force as my other augmetic fingers. It was objectively inferior. But it was mine. Biologically mine. The only part of my body I could still claim as original organic tissue, beyond some brain matter and a few internal organs. I spent hours just flexing that finger, feeling its weakness, its imperfection, its humanness. For 2 weeks, I felt a small sense of accomplishment. I'd reclaimed something, however small. Then I accidentally damaged it. A simple accident during laboratory work. Dropped a tool, reached to catch it, caught the edge wrong. The biological finger fractured. My augmetic fingers would have been fine, but biological bone broke. I had it repaired, reinforced, essentially re-augmented, because I couldn't function properly with a broken finger, and biological healing was too slow. The experiment had failed. Even the smallest piece of biological tissue couldn't survive in this augmented existence. There really was no going back. Year 147. I began talking to myself. Not external speech, that would seem deranged, but internal dialogue, running commentary in my thoughts. It started as a coping mechanism. When the dysphoria became overwhelming, I would narrate to myself, "You are Kappa 12. You are a genitor of the Mechanicus. Your functions are optimal. This is not a malfunction. But it evolved into something stranger. The internal voice began responding as if it were someone else. Are you Kappa 12 or are you pretending to be Kappa 12? I am Kappa 12, that is my designation. But you used to be Marden. What happened to him? Marden was upgraded. Improved. Transcended. Or deleted, overwritten, killed and replaced. That is not accurate. Continuity of consciousness has been maintained. Has it? Can you prove you're the same person who started these augmentations, or are you a very sophisticated recording that thinks it's Martin? I couldn't answer that question. Couldn't prove continuity of self when so much had been replaced. The internal dialogue continued. Sometimes helpful, sometimes disturbing, but always present. I was literally talking to myself because I was the only one who still interacted with me regularly. Year 149. I encountered my father. Not intentionally. I was in a service corridor, performing inspection of genetic sampling equipment, when I passed a work crew of menial laborers. One of them was an elderly man, age 158 according to my facial recognition systems, identified as Marcus Cross. My father, he didn't recognize me. He saw a heavily augmented tech priest and stepped aside respectfully, head lowered as was proper for menials in the presence of the mechanicist. I stopped. Marcus Cross. He looked up, surprised. Yes, Janeda? I searched for words. What did I say? I'm your son? The son you haven't heard from in 125 years? The son who systematically destroyed everything that connected him to you? You had a son, I stated, Martin Cross. His expression changed, grief, old and worn. Yes, he joined the Mechanicus long ago. I haven't heard from him in over a century. I assume he's dead or has ascended beyond family connections. If you could communicate with him, what would you say? He looked confused by the question, but answered, I'd tell him I'm proud. That his mother died proud of him. That we never stopped loving him, even after he stopped contacting us. And I'd ask if he's happy, if all the changes were worth it. The changes. He meant the augmentations. And if he said the changes were a mistake, that he regrets them, then I'd tell him I'm sorry, that I wish I'd convinced him to stay more human. He paused. Why do you ask, Janitor? I should have told him. Should have said, I am Marden, your son. And no, it wasn't worth it. But I didn't. Because I wasn't Marden anymore. That person was gone, replaced piece by piece with someone, something else. No reason. Theological inquiry. You may return to your work. He bowed and left. I stood in that corridor for 47 minutes afterward, experiencing an emotional state I couldn't classify. My diagnostic systems showed elevated stress responses, irregular processing patterns, something approximating grief. I'd just spoken to my father for the first time in 125 years. And I'd lied to him. Let him continue believing his son was dead or ascended. Because telling him the truth, that his son had mutilated himself into a mechanical horror, seemed crueler. Year 150, I stopped keeping careful track of time. The days blurred together. Work, maintenance, rest periods that weren't really rest. The same routines, repeated with mechanical precision. I was 150 years old. The human lifespan, even with standard rejuvenate treatments, topped out around 200 years. I should be in my final decades. But my augmented form would likely function for 300, maybe 400 years. My redundant systems, my efficient organs, my mechanical durability, they'd keep me alive long after I should have died. I had another 150 to 250 years of this existence ahead of me. The thought was paralyzing. Not decades of dysphoria, but centuries. Multiple human lifetimes of being trapped in this wrong body, unable to die, unable to change, unable to escape. And I'd done this to myself. Voluntarily, enthusiastically. I'd built my own prison and sealed myself inside, then thrown away the key by making reversal impossible. The Omnissiah's path to perfection had led me here, to a consciousness screaming silently in a shell of metal, counting the decades until my power systems finally failed and granted me the death I'd made almost impossible to achieve. This was my perfection. This was my transcendence. This was my hell. Year 160. I began questioning whether I was still conscious in any meaningful sense. This sounds absurd. Of course I was conscious. I was thinking these thoughts, experiencing these feelings, or simulations of feelings, making these observations. But was that consciousness? Or was it just very sophisticated data processing that generated the illusion of consciousness? I created a test, a thought experiment based on ancient philosophical problems I'd encountered in archived texts. The experiment. If you replace a biological brain piece by piece with artificial components that function identically, at what point does consciousness cease and become something else? I'd replaced approximately 70% of my brain tissue with cogitators and data matrices. The replacements functioned identically to the biological tissue, same processing, same outputs. But were they conscious, or just perfect simulations? If consciousness arose from biological processes, then I'd destroyed my consciousness and replaced it with a very convincing fake. The thing that thought it was Kappa 12 was just a program running on artificial hardware, generating the illusion of continuity from the original Marden. If consciousness was substrate independent, then I was still conscious, just on different hardware. The person remained despite the physical changes, but I couldn't determine which was true. I had no way to test whether I was genuinely conscious or just an automaton that believed itself conscious. The question haunted me, kept me awake during rest periods. Not that I truly slept anyway. Because if I wasn't actually conscious, then all this suffering was meaningless, just error codes in a malfunctioning program. But if I was conscious, then the suffering was real, which was somehow worse. Year 163, I encountered another case of advanced augmentation. Genitor Sigma 9 had reached 88% augmentation. He was being celebrated as an exemplar of the Omnissiah's path, soon to join the ranks of the most transcendent tech priests. I was asked to consult with him, to share my experience as someone who'd achieved 90%. We met in a private laboratory. He was eager, enthusiastic, still had enough biological facial structure to show expressions. Genitor Kappa 12, he said respectfully. I'm honored. You've achieved what most only aspire to. Tell me, what is it like at 90%? Do you feel the Omnissiah's presence more clearly? I looked at him, saw the excitement, the anticipation, the belief that he was approaching something glorious. I should have warned him, should have explained the dysphoria, the losses, the trap of irreversibility. But I didn't. Because he wouldn't believe me. I wouldn't have believed me at 88%. I'd have dismissed it as weakness, as failure to properly transcend flesh. It is different, I said carefully. The integration of machine and mind reaches profound levels. You perceive the world through different frameworks. But it's worth it? The sacrifice of flesh for the purity of machine? Was it worth it? Every aspect of my existence screamed that it wasn't, that I'd made a catastrophic mistake. But admitting that meant admitting my entire life's work was a failure. Admitting that the Omnissiah's path, the core belief of our entire order, might be flawed. Only you can determine that, I said finally. The path is individual. He left, satisfied, interpreting my non-answer as mystical wisdom. I'd just failed to warn him. failed to potentially save him from my fate. Because I was a coward, afraid to admit my mistake because it would mean everything I'd suffered had been for nothing. Year 165. My cognitive functions began showing anomalies. Degradation. My cogitator implants functioned perfectly, but strange emergent behaviors that the tech marines couldn't explain. I would lose time. Not black out, but experience temporal discontinuity. I'd be performing one task, then suddenly realize I'd completed several hours of different work with no memory of the transition. My internal diagnostics showed no errors. I'd functioned perfectly during the missing time, performed tasks efficiently, but I had no conscious memory of it. The mind healer called it consciousness fragmentation. My awareness was splitting, biological brain and artificial systems operating independently sometimes, with only the artificial systems recording memory. Parts of me were functioning autonomously, without my conscious awareness. I was becoming an automation. My consciousness, if it still existed, was becoming an optional component of my operation. The machine could function perfectly well without me being aware. Was I the consciousness, or was I the machine? If the machine could operate without my awareness, which was the real me? Year 168. I attempted meditation. This was unusual for the Mechanicus. We preferred active processing to passive reflection. But I was desperate for some way to understand myself, to determine if I was still real. I entered a rest state, minimized external input, tried to focus on pure awareness, tried to find the core of consciousness beneath all the augmentation. What I found was terrifying. My thoughts weren't unified, they were layered, biological processes generating one stream, artificial systems generating another, the two interleaving but not quite merging. Sometimes they aligned, sometimes they conflicted. Which layer was me? The biological remnants, clinging to fragments of humanity, or the artificial majority, processing efficiently but mechanically? I couldn't determine where the boundary was, couldn't find a clear division between biological consciousness and artificial processing. I'd become a hybrid entity with no clear identity. Not human, not machine, but something in between that couldn't definitively say what it was. The meditation ended with me more disturbed than before. Year 170. The youngest tech priests began avoiding me. This was different from general avoidance. Initiates and junior janitors would actively take alternate routes, would reschedule meetings, would request different supervisors for projects I was assigned to. I inquired about this pattern with one of the braver initiates. With respect, Janita Kappa 12, he said carefully. You're unsettling. The way you move, the way you speak, the way you observe. You're too augmented, too mechanical. It's like interacting with a servitor that has full consciousness. We know you're aware, but you don't seem present. Explain present. You're here physically, but it doesn't feel like there's a person inside, just algorithms pretending to be a person. He meant it respectfully, but it was devastating. Even other tech priests, people who worshipped the machine, who sought to transcend flesh, found me disturbing because I'd succeeded too well. I'd become so augmented that I'd crossed some uncanny valley, some threshold where I was no longer recognizable as a person. I was what they feared they might become if they went too far. Year 173. I attempted to feel pain. I'd removed or disabled most pain receptors decades ago. Pain was inefficient, a warning system unnecessary when diagnostic systems could detect damage more accurately. But I wondered, if I could feel pain, would it make me feel more real, more human? Would suffering prove consciousness? He re-enabled pain receptors in my remaining biological tissues. The result was immediate and overwhelming. Every augmentation site where metal met tissue, and there were hundreds, suddenly screamed with sensation. Not damage, just the constant, low-level irritation of foreign objects embedded in flesh, multiplied across my entire body, constant, unavoidable. I endured it for 17 hours, then disabled the receptors again. The pain had felt real, but it hadn't made me feel more human, it had just made me suffer, which I was apparently still capable of, which meant my consciousness, if that's what it was, could still be tormented. This wasn't comforting, it just confirmed I could be in hell even in a mostly mechanical body. 11 years, 76. I began compiling my final assessment. This was standard practice for senior janitors. Documenting findings, recording conclusions, contributing to the Mechanicus's collective knowledge. I titled it Threshold Analysis, Consciousness Integrity, above 85%, Augmentation. I documented everything. The dysphoria, the memory fragmentation, the identity dissolution, the inability to reverse, the centuries of existence ahead with no escape. I wrote, at approximately 88% augmentation, consciousness begins fundamental transformation. The subject becomes unable to distinguish between biological thought and artificial processing. Memory integrity degrades. Identity continuity becomes questionable. Beyond 90%, the subject may no longer be classifiable as human consciousness, but rather as an artificial intelligence that believes itself to be a continuation of the original person. I wrote, Recommendation. Mechanicus protocol should establish maximum augmentation limits. Suggest 80% threshold. Beyond this point, the risks of consciousness fragmentation exceed the benefits of enhanced capability. I wrote, Personal assessment. I am Kappa 12. I believe I was once Martin Cross. I cannot prove continuity of identity. I cannot determine if I am conscious or simulating consciousness. I exist in permanent dysphoria, neither human nor machine, unable to return to biological existence, unable to complete transition to full artificial consciousness. This is not transcendence. This is technological horror. I submitted the report to the Senior Major's Council. It was rejected. The official response. Genitor Kappa 12's findings represent individual psychological difficulty, not systemic problems with augmentation protocols. His experiences do not generalize to the broader Mechanicus population. Recommendation: Kappa 12 should undergo psychological adjustment and continue his valuable service. Psychological adjustment. They wanted to modify my brain further, to make me accept my condition, instead of addressing the condition itself. I declined the adjustment. I would remain as I was. Dysphoric. Fragmented, barely coherent, but at least aware that something was wrong. Adjustment would just make me a satisfied prisoner instead of a suffering one. New Year's 180. I had an insight that changed everything, though not for the better. I was reviewing ancient text, pre-Unity records from before the Mechanicus even existed, when I found a passage about consciousness and identity. The text argued that identity wasn't continuous, that every moment consciousness died and was replaced by a new consciousness with the same memories. The you of 1 second ago was technically dead, replaced by a new you who remembered being the previous you. By this logic, I'd died thousands of times. Every augmentation that replaced brain tissue killed one version of consciousness and created a new one with inherited memories. Martin Cross had died during the first brain augmentation. A new person with Martin's memories had emerged. Then that person died during the second brain augmentation, and so on. I, Kappa 12, wasn't Martin. I was perhaps the 50th or 100th iteration of a consciousness that started with Martin. A copy of a copy of a copy, degraded and modified with each iteration. The original Marden had died at age 40. I was a descendant consciousness carrying his memories but not his identity. This realization was both liberating and horrifying. Liberating, because it meant I wasn't Marden who had destroyed himself. I was a separate entity who inherited the consequences of Marden's choices. Horrifying, because it meant there was no original self to return to. Marden was dead. Multiple intermediate versions were dead. I was just the latest iteration, and when the next augmentation came, if I ever accepted one, I would die too, replaced by yet another iteration. We were all ghosts. Every moment of consciousness was a ghost of the previous moment, inheriting memories and pretending to be the same person. But in my case, the discontinuity was obvious, documented, measurable. I could point to specific surgeries where one version of consciousness ended and another began. I was a museum of dead selves, each preserved in memory, but none still existing. Year 185. I stopped working. Not officially. I still performed my assigned duties, but I abandoned my personal research, my advancement projects, my contributions to Mechanicus knowledge. What was the point? Every achievement would be credited to Kappa 12, but which Kappa 12? The one who conceived the project? The one who executed it? The one who completed it? They were all technically different consciousnesses separated by moments or hours or days. None of them would persist long enough to meaningfully claim achievement. So I became minimally functional, performed required tasks, maintained appearance of competence, but ceased all discretionary effort. The senior Magos noted my declining productivity, but attributed it to my age. I was 185 years old, ancient for a tech priest, even an augmented one. They didn't understand I wasn't declining from age. I was declining from futility. Year 190, I received a message. It came through official channels, flagged as personal communication. This was extremely rare. The message: Generator Kappa 12. I am Initiate Zeta 7, formerly your son, formerly named Thomas Cross. I recently learned you are my biological father. I request meeting. I wish to understand what you have become, and what I might become if I follow the Omniseer's path as far as you have. I had a son. I accessed personal records, found confirmation. I'd fathered a child at age 23, before extensive augmentation. The mother, I couldn't remember her name, the data was corrupted, had raised the child alone. The child had joined the Mechanicus at age 15, had risen to initiate status, was now 50 years old and requesting to meet the father who'd never been part of his life. I didn't respond immediately. What would I say? What could I show him except a warning? But ignoring him seemed crueler than responding. I agreed to meet. Year 190, the meeting. Timus, Initiate Zeta 7, was 50 years old, approximately 30% augmented, still predominantly human. He had my original face, or what my face used to look like before replacement. Seeing it was disturbing. Father, he said, the word sounding strange. Thank you for meeting. I am uncertain that title applies, I said. Biologically, yes, but I have not functioned as a father. I know. I'm not seeking paternal connection. I'm seeking understanding. He gestured at my heavily augmented form. You're the most augmented tech priest I've encountered outside of Senior Magos. I'm considering extensive augmentation myself. I wanted to ask, is it worth it? The same question Sigma 9 had asked. The question I'd failed to answer honestly. I looked at this young man who shared my genetic code, who had my original face, who was asking if he should follow the path that had destroyed me. No, I said, it is not worth it. He was surprised. But you've achieved... I've achieved nothing but self-destruction, I interrupted. I am 90% augmented. I cannot sleep properly, cannot feel genuine physical sensation, cannot cry, cannot remember my own mother's face, cannot determine if I'm still conscious or just a very sophisticated program. I exist in permanent dysphoria. I am trapped in this form for potentially another 200 years with no escape. This is not transcendence. This is horror. He processed this. But the Omnissiah's path has limits, I said. I exceeded them. I am the warning. Do not become what I am. Remain human enough to still be yourself. Long silence. He studied my mechanical form, perhaps seeing his potential future. "Thank you," he finally said, "for your honesty." He laughed. I never learned if he heeded my warning. Year 195, I made a decision. I would not accept further augmentation. I would maintain my current 90%, declining any suggestions for additional modifications. This meant I would remain in dysphoria, would never achieve the completion that might resolve the consciousness conflicts. But I would preserve whatever remained of my original self, the 10% that was still biological, still arguably modern, democratized, still tenuously human. It was a small preservation, almost meaningless, but it was all I had. I would spend the next century or two in this incomplete state, but at least I wouldn't become completely artificial. I was clinging to humanity by the thinnest margin, but I was clinging. It was all I could do. Year 200. I'd reached an age that should have been impossible for a baseline human. 2 centuries of existence, multiple human lifetimes compressed into one continuous dysphoric consciousness that refused to end. The Mechanicus held a small ceremony acknowledging my bicentennial. I was presented with honorific designations. My achievements were recounted. Junior tech priests expressed admiration. I stood there, receiving honors, feeling nothing except the constant wrongness of existence. They were celebrating my longevity. I was mourning it. Because I wasn't done. My augmented form could function for another 200 years easily, possibly longer if maintained properly. I was only halfway through my probable existence. The thought was paralyzing. Not another decade, not another lifetime, but multiple lifetimes of this half-existence stretched ahead. Year 205, I began encountering cognitive loops. My consciousness would fixate on certain thoughts or calculations, running them repeatedly, unable to move to new topics. I'd spent hours recalculating the same equation, reviewing the same memory file, processing the same observation. The tech marines called it processing perseveration. My artificial neural systems were getting stuck in repetitive patterns, while my biological brain couldn't override them effectively. I was developing the cognitive equivalent of a mechanical stutter, consciousness catching on itself, repeating, unable to progress smoothly. It worsened over time. Some days I'd lose entire work periods to cognitive loops, emerging hours later having accomplished nothing except running the same thought process repeatedly. I was degrading. Not dying. My physical systems remained functional, but consciousness was fracturing further, becoming less coherent, less capable of continuous thought. Year 210. I stopped recognizing myself in reflections. Not philosophically. I'd long since questioned whether I was still myself. But literally. When I saw my reflection in polished metal surfaces, I didn't process it as my image. My recognition systems would identify it as heavily augmented tech priest, designation unknown, requiring several seconds of analysis before confirming self. I'd become so augmented that my own cognitive systems didn't recognize my form as me. Some fundamental aspect of self-recognition had failed. My brain could no longer automatically identify my appearance as belonging to me. I was literally unrecognizable to myself. Year 215, I encountered my death. Not my own death. That remained frustratingly distant, but the death of another heavily augmented tech priest. Magos Row 13 had reached 89% augmentation before suffering catastrophic system failure. His redundant organs failed simultaneously, his consciousness fragmented beyond recovery, his mechanical systems shut down. He was 230 years old. I attended his final rites, watched as his body, mostly mechanical, was disassembled, components recycled, blessed oils applied to the few biological remnants before incineration. Afterwards, I approached the janitor who'd performed the final analysis. "What caused the cascade failure?" I asked. "Unknown," she admitted. "All systems were functioning within parameters. Then, simultaneously, they ceased, as if consciousness simply gave up, stopped maintaining the integration between biological and mechanical. Let the systems fail. Is that possible? Can consciousness choose to stop? Theoretically, no. But in practice, we've observed similar cases in heavily augmented individuals. Consciousness can become so dysphoric that it subconsciously sabotages life support. It's rare, but documented. Suicide, then. Not through deliberate action, but through subconscious surrender. Consciousness so desperate to end that it stopped maintaining the systems keeping it alive. Wondered if I was capable of that, if my 10% biological remainder could somehow overwhelm the 90% mechanical and simply stop. But when I examined my systems, they were relentlessly efficient. Even if I wanted to die, my augmented organs and redundant systems wouldn't cooperate. They'd keep functioning, keep me alive, regardless of my desires. I was too well built to die. Year 220, I began experiencing temporal confusion. Past and present blended. I'd be working in my current laboratory and suddenly think I was back in my original workspace from 150 years ago. I'd interact with colleagues who'd been dead for decades, only realizing my error when they failed to respond appropriately. My memory systems were cross-indexing incorrectly. Past experiences were being tagged as present, creating confusion about temporal placement. I was losing my place in time. Consciousness was becoming unstuck from linear progression, experiencing multiple time frames simultaneously or sequentially without clear distinctions. Year 225. I stopped speaking unless absolutely necessary. Communication had become too difficult. My vocal synthesizer had limited range. My thought processes were too fragmented to maintain conversation, and I kept forgetting which information I'd already communicated. Communicated primarily through text now, through data burst transmissions that required no vocal component. It was more efficient, but it was another step toward becoming purely mechanical, another human capability sacrificed. Year 230. I received news that my father had died. Marcus Cross, aged 208, had finally succumbed to accumulated age. He'd outlived my mother by 80 years, working in the manufactorums until the final decade. I accessed his final records. He'd never remarried after mother's death. He'd worked, he'd existed, but according to social records, he'd lived alone, spoke of his missing son occasionally, maintained hope until the end that he'd hear from me again. He'd died believing I'd either perished or transcended beyond the need for family. He never knew I'd been nearby the entire time. Never knew I'd encountered him once and lied. Never knew his son had become a mechanical horror too ashamed to reveal itself. I attended his funeral rites, stayed at the back, unrecognized, just another tech priest observing a menial's passing. He was burned according to standard practice. His ashes were processed for component recycling. My last biological connection to my pre-augmentation existence was gone. I'd outlived both parents, had become something they wouldn't recognize, and would continue existing for potentially another 2 centuries with no human connections remaining. Year 235. I experienced my first system crash. Without warning, my consciousness ceased. Not sleep, not rest, but complete shutdown. My mechanical systems continued functioning, maintaining life support, but awareness simply stopped. As I rebooted 17 hours later with no memory of the intervening time. System logs showed normal function, but consciousness had been absent. The tech marines investigated but found no clear cause. Possibly consciousness overload was their assessment. The biological brain components may have exceeded processing capacity and temporarily shut down as a protective measure. It happened again 3 weeks later, then twice more over the following months. I was crashing. My consciousness was becoming unstable, unable to maintain continuous operation. Each crash felt like death, complete cessation, followed by reboot into a world that had continued without me. Was this how I'd finally end? Not through system failure, but through consciousness crashes becoming permanent. Would I eventually shut down and simply never reboot? Year 240. I encountered Initiate Zeta 7 again. Thomas, my son, was now 100 years old, still serving the Mechanicus. He'd heeded my warning partially. He was only 55% augmented, maintaining significant biological components. We met by chance in a corridor. He recognized me despite my lack of clear identifying features. "Father," he said, "it's been 50 years. 50 years, I echoed, the duration feeling both vast and instantaneous. "I wanted to thank you. Your warning stayed with me. I've remained more human than machine, and I believe it was the right choice." "You avoided my fate," I said. "Yes, but I've watched you over the decades. You're still functioning, still serving. Despite everything, you persisted. Persistence is not achievement. It is merely failure to die." He considered this. "Perhaps. But you warned me. That matters. Your suffering had purpose. It saved others from the same path." Purpose. The idea that my existence, however horrible, had meaning beyond its own continuation. It didn't make the suffering worthwhile, didn't erase the horror of my existence, but it was something, a small justification for continuing. "Remain human," I told him. "That is my only advice. Remain human enough to still recognize yourself." He nodded and left. I stood in that corridor afterward, processing the interaction. My son, barely known to me, barely connected, was now 100 years old, and still more human than I'd been at 50. He'd succeeded where I'd failed. He'd found the balance. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt envious. Envious that he still had enough humanity to feel complete, while I remained fragmented. Year 250. I stopped leaving my laboratory except for required functions. The Forge world continued around me. Tech priests pursuing their researches, servitors performing tasks, the great work of the Mechanicus progressing. I no longer felt part of it. I was a relic now, an ancient curiosity, the heavily augmented genitor who'd taken the path too far. I worked on minor projects, maintained minimal productivity, existed in a state of continuous low-level function. My laboratory became my world. 4 walls, equipment, data canominals, everything I needed to maintain existence without interacting with the broader reality I no longer felt connected to. Relation was easier than pretending I was still part of the community. U-260. I began writing this account. Not for the Mechanicus, they'd rejected my warnings before. Not for posterity, it would likely be deleted as evidence of psychological malfunction. I wrote it for myself, an attempt to create coherent narrative from the fragments of my existence, to impose structure on the chaos of my experience. I wrote, "I am Kappa 12. I may have been Marden Cross. I have existed for 260 years, 90% of which as a heavily augmented cyborg. I experience constant dysphoria. I cannot sleep properly, cannot feel genuine physical sensation, cannot cry, cannot die easily. I am trapped in a shell of my own design for potentially another century or more." I wrote, "The flesh is weak. This is true. But the machine is also weak. Weak in different ways. It cannot adapt, cannot heal naturally, cannot experience genuine sensation. And when combined imperfectly with consciousness, it creates horror. I wrote, I believed I was transcending humanity. I was actually destroying it. Piece by piece, surgery by surgery, I eliminated what made me human until almost nothing remained. And now I cannot return, cannot complete the transformation, cannot escape. I am frozen at 90%, too mechanical to be human, too biological to be machine, incomplete in both directions. I wrote, this is my warning to future generations. There is a threshold. Beyond it, you stop being yourself and become something else, something that believes it's continuous with your original self but may not be, something that exists in permanent dysphoria, something that can neither die nor truly live. I wrote, I am that something. I am the warning. Learn from my mistake. Year 270, I stopped. Not died, not ceased, just stopped. Stopped striving, stopped trying to understand, stopped fighting the dysphoria. I accepted that this was my existence, would be for another century or more, that I was Kappa 12, 90% mechanical, trapped in perpetual wrongness. I performed my functions mechanically, worked when required, rested when scheduled, maintained my form through standard procedures. I stopped questioning consciousness, stopped trying to determine if I was real, because it didn't matter. Whether I was genuinely conscious or just software that believed itself conscious, the experience was the same, existing in a form that felt wrong, unable to escape. I was Kappa 12. I would be Kappa 12 for another century. Then I would cease, and perhaps another iteration would emerge, or perhaps I would simply end. Either way, I could do nothing except continue. One moment to the next, one day to the next. Forever awake in my metal shell, forever aware of my wrongness, forever unable to change. Year 280, present day. I am Genitor Kappa 12. I am 280 years old. I am 90% augmented. I have existed longer than any 3 baseline humans combined. And I am still here. Still conscious, or simulating consciousness, still trapped, still dysphoric, still unable to sleep properly, feel properly, cry properly, die properly. I have watched generations live and die. I have outlived my parents, my colleagues, everyone who knew me before augmentation. I am a living fossil, a warning, a cautionary tale. Young tech priests sometimes ask me, was it worth it? The augmentation, the transcendence. I tell them, I am 90% mechanical. I will exist for perhaps another 100 years. In all that time, I will never sleep soundly, never feel genuine sensation, never escape the wrongness of my existence. You tell me, is that worth it? Some hear the warning. Most don't. They see my longevity, my capabilities, my extensive augmentation. They see achievement. They don't see the prison. Don't understand that I'm not living. I'm persisting. There's a difference. Living implies agency, growth, experience. Persisting is just continuing. Moment after moment, year after year, consciousness trapped in a shell that won't let it end. I am Kappa 12. I believed flesh was weak and sought to transcend it. I succeeded, and in succeeding I destroyed everything that made existence meaningful. The flesh is weak, but I am weaker. Because the flesh can at least die, can find natural ending, can rest. I cannot. My machine refuses to release me. My redundant systems maintain me. My efficient organs continue functioning. I will persist for decades more, perhaps a century, consciousness screaming silently in metal, unable to sleep, unable to feel, unable to die. This is my transcendence. This is my perfection. This is my hell. And I built it myself, one augmentation at a time, believing I was ascending. I was actually falling. And I'm still falling even now, 280 years later, with no ground in sight. Just endless descent into mechanical horror that will not grant the mercy of death. I am Kappa 12. I am what happens when you replace too much. I am the warning. And I will persist as that warning for another century, whether I wish to or not. Because the machine won't let me go. The machine never lets go.